It was a stormy night when Ellie found herself home alone for the first time in the old family house her parents had recently inherited. The weather had turned quickly, the rain pelting against the windows with a fury that matched the rolling thunder. Lightning streaked across the dark sky, briefly illuminating the large, isolated house surrounded by dense woods. Ellie, a college sophomore, was supposed to spend the weekend with her friends in the city, but a sudden flu outbreak at her campus had left her plans drenched in disappointment. Instead, she decided to stay at her family's new acquisition, a sprawling mansion with a history as murky as the storm clouds overhead. As she settled onto the couch with a blanket and a book, the house creaked and groaned around her, the sounds of an old building settling, or so she told herself. The wind howled through the trees, creating eerie, whistling sounds that seemed almost whisper-like. Trying to ignore her growing unease, Ellie turned on the living room lamp, casting a warm glow that fought back the creeping darkness from the corners of the room. Just as she was beginning to relax, a loud crash from the kitchen made her jump. Heart pounding, she hesitated, straining her ears for any follow-up sounds. Hearing nothing more, she mustered her courage and tiptoed toward the kitchen. The floorboards creaked under her weight, echoing eerily through the empty house. As she reached the kitchen, she saw that a window had blown open, its curtains fluttering violently in the stormy gusts, and a vase previously placed on the windowsill had shattered on the floor. Relieved but still on edge, Ellie closed the window, locking it securely. She cleaned up the broken vase, her hands shaking slightly. "It's just the storm," she whispered to herself, trying to calm her nerves. She returned to the living room, but the sense of unease clung to her like the cold. Back in the living room, Ellie tried to focus on her book, but the words blurred before her eyes as the shadows seemed to deepen around her. The storm intensified, the house creaking louder now, punctuated by the occasional thunderclap. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging her into darkness. "Great," Ellie muttered, fumbling for her phone. Its light seemed feeble in the enveloping blackness. Remembering that the house's circuit breaker was in the basement, a chill ran down her spine. The basement, her father had mentioned, was old and rarely used, a place that held remnants of the house's original furnishings and, perhaps, its original secrets. With a deep breath, Ellie turned on her phone's flashlight and headed toward the basement door. Each step seemed to echo ominously around her, mixing with the sound of the storm outside. She opened the basement door slowly, the hinges groaning loudly, a sound that seemed almost like a moan. Descending the stairs, Ellie's flashlight cast long, sinister shadows against the walls. The air grew colder as she reached the bottom. The basement was cluttered with old furniture covered in dusty sheets and cobwebs strung between wooden beams. As she moved toward the circuit breaker, her light fell upon a large mirror propped against the wall. Startled by her own reflection, she laughed nervously, a sound that seemed out of place in the suffocating silence of the basement. She quickly reset the breaker, and the house lights flickered back to life, casting a reassuring glow that filtered down to the basement. Relieved, Ellie turned to head back upstairs when she saw it. In the brief moment before she turned, her flashlight beam had caught another reflection in the mirror, a shadowy figure standing just behind her. Whirling around, Ellie shone her light on the spot where she had seen the figure, her heart racing. But there was nothing there, just an old armchair covered with a sheet. Shuddering, she told herself it was just her imagination, a trick of the light and shadows. As she hurried back upstairs, the feeling of being watched crept over her. The house seemed to close in around her, the storm raging outside now mirroring the tumult of fear inside her. Once back in the living room, Ellie tried to settle down, but the image of the shadowy figure haunted her thoughts. She decided to distract herself by exploring the online history of the house on her laptop. As she delved into the past, she discovered chilling stories, tales of the original owner, a reclusive man rumored to have been involved in dark practices, mysterious disappearances of people in the area, and stories of unexplained phenomena within the house itself. Absorbed in her research, Ellie didn't notice the time slipping by, nor the gradual quieting of the storm. It was only when she read a particularly harrowing account of a young woman, seen only in reflections within the house and then never seen again, that Ellie felt a cold shiver traverse her spine. The description matched too closely with what she thought she saw in the basement mirror. As she read the final line of the old news article, a sudden cold gust swept through the room, despite all windows being securely shut. Ellie snapped her laptop shut, her heart pounding in her chest. The silence of the house was now complete. The storm had passed, leaving a suffocating stillness in its wake. Every shadow seemed to flicker with potential movement, every noise a signal of something amiss. The feeling of dread that had been growing was now palpable, a thick tension in the air that seemed almost alive. Trying to calm her nerves, Ellie decided to make a cup of tea. As she walked to the kitchen, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as she passed the dark hallway leading to the basement. The door, which she remembered closing, was now slightly ajar. In the kitchen, Ellie hurriedly filled the kettle, her movements jerky with nervous energy. The familiar routine did little to soothe her. As she waited for the water to boil, she heard a faint noise, like whispering. It seemed to come from the basement. Holding her breath, she listened intently. The whispering grew louder, a chorus of indistinct voices, as if a crowd was hidden in the shadows of the house. Panic rising, Ellie grabbed the largest kitchen knife she could find. The whispering stopped abruptly as if aware of her actions. The silence was now even more terrifying, a heavy blanket that smothered her brave front. She backed away from the kitchen, knife in hand, her eyes darting around, searching for any sign of movement. As she stepped into the hallway, the lights flickered and dimmed, casting long shadows across the floor. A cold breeze swept through the house again, and the basement door slowly creaked open further. Frozen in place, Ellie watched as a dark figure slowly emerged from the gloom below. The figure was shrouded in darkness, its features indiscernible, but its presence was overwhelmingly oppressive. Ellie felt a chill deep in her bones, a primal fear that rooted her to the spot. The figure paused at the foot of the basement stairs, its head slowly tilting as if examining her. Summoning every ounce of courage she had left, Ellie raised the knife, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Who are you? What do you want?" The figure remained silent, its head still cocked in that eerie, unnatural angle. Then, slowly, it began to ascend the stairs, each step deliberate and soundless. Ellie wanted to run, to escape the approaching horror, but her feet refused to move. Just as the figure reached the top of the stairs, the lights flickered violently and then went out completely, plunging the house into darkness. Ellie heard her own breath, ragged and loud in the silent darkness, as she felt the cold presence of the figure now standing mere inches away from her. In the pitch black, Ellie swung the knife wildly, her terror manifesting in desperate aggression. There was no sound of contact, no cry of pain, just the whispering breeze that circled her, the voices louder now, mocking, taunting. As her eyes adjusted to the darkness, the figure seemed to dissolve into the shadows, becoming part of the house itself. The oppressive feeling did not lift, however, it hung in the air like a malevolent fog. Ellie, heart pounding out of her chest, slowly backed away toward the living room, her grip on the knife unyielding. Once there, she collapsed onto the couch, exhausted and trembling. Their house was quiet once more, but it was a deceptive quiet, full of hidden threats. Ellie knew she couldn't leave, not yet. The figure, the voices, the history of the house, all of it was intertwined, and she was caught in the middle. She had to understand, to find out what was binding her to this place, and what it wanted from her. With dawn still hours away and the house enveloping her in its dark embrace, Ellie steeled herself for the long night ahead. She had to survive until morning, to uncover the secrets hidden in the shadows of the house. The story of the house was not done with her yet, and she was not done with it. The whispers started again, this time right next to her ear, as if the house itself was speaking. "Stay," it whispered, a single word that echoed through the halls. Ellie, gripping the knife, prepared for whatever would come next, knowing that the true horror of the house had only just begun to reveal itself. Ellie's eyes darted across the shadowy contours of the living room, her breathing shallow as the whispered command hung in the air. "Stay," the voice murmured again, its tone dragging like fingers across a gravestone, resonating with a chilling familiarity. She tightened her grip on the knife, her only tangible defense against the intangible horrors that stalked the boundaries of her perception. The silence that followed was stifling, punctuated only by the rhythmic tick of the grandfather clock in the corner, a steady reminder that time was both her ally and enemy this night. She strained her ears, hoping to discern any movement over the clock's relentless cadence. Nothing stirred, yet the sensation of being watched, of being evaluated by unseen eyes, clawed at her nerves relentlessly. Compelled by a mixture of fear and the need to confront whatever haunted the house, Ellie stood. Her legs were stiff, her movements jerky with apprehension. She made her way to the hallway, each step an act of willpower. The air felt denser as she approached the basement door once again, the epicenter of the night's eerie occurrences. The door stood slightly ajar, as if inviting her into the bowels of the house. A cold draft emanated from the darkness below, carrying with it the faint, unmistakable scent of decay. Swallowing her fear, Ellie angled her phone's flashlight toward the gaping darkness, its beam slicing through the thick air, catching motes of dust dancing like specters in the light. Descending the stairs, each creak seemed to mock her tentative steps, warning her back. The basement air was colder, the earlier whispers now silent, leaving only the sound of her own labored breathing. Her light landed on the mirror again, the same mirror where she had seen the figure standing behind her. It stood innocuous now, just a piece of glass framed in ornate wood, yet it felt like an unspoken challenge. As she reached the bottom of the stairs, Ellie's flashlight flickered, a brief hiccup of darkness that sent her heart into her throat. She shook it, a meaningless but reflexive action, and the light steadied. Moving closer to the mirror, she hesitated, her reflection staring back at her, a pale, frightened version of herself. She touched the glass, half expecting it to ripple like water under her fingers. It was solid, cold, and surprisingly smooth. Turning away from the mirror, Ellie explored the rest of the basement. There were shelves lined with old books, their leather covers cracked and pages yellowed with age. Dusty furniture was haphazardly placed around the room, and in the far corner, under a tarp, she found an old chest. Her curiosity piqued despite the gnawing fear, she pulled the tarp away. The chest was carved with intricate symbols, some of which she recognized from the stories she had read about the house earlier. They spoke of protection and binding, suggesting that whatever was contained within was not meant to be released. Her hands trembled as she reached for the clasp. It flipped open with an eerie ease, as if it had been waiting for her touch. Inside, Ellie found an assortment of objects, a dried-up inkwell, a stack of letters bound by a faded ribbon, and a small, leather-bound book. She picked up the book, dusting off the cover. It was a diary, the entries dating back over a century. The first page bore warning in a scrawling, urgent hand, "Read and beware, for knowledge is both the key and the curse." Ellie began to read, her flashlight casting an unsteady light over the faded words. The diary belonged to a woman named Abigail, the wife of the house's original owner. Abigail wrote of her growing unease in the house, of strange noises and whispers that plagued the night, and of her husband's descent into madness driven by an obsession with immortality and dark rituals. As Ellie turned the pages, absorbing Abigail's fears and warnings, a cold realization settled over her. The stories she had read online, the figure in the mirror, the whispering voices, all were echoes of a past steeped in darkness, a past that clung to the bones of the house. A sudden, sharp creak jolted Ellie from the diary. She snapped her head up, her flashlight sweeping across the basement. The light flickered again, then died completely, leaving her enveloped in an oppressive darkness. A cold breath whispered across her neck, and a voice, softer than a sigh but clear in the silence, whispered, "Thank you for releasing me." Frozen in place, Ellie felt the darkness deepen, a tangible presence encircling her. The air thickened, and the whispers returned, louder now, a chorus of voices rising in a cacophony of desperation and madness. The ground beneath her seemed to pulse with life, the very foundation of the house resonating with the energies of the dark rituals that had been performed here. Ellie, her heart hammering against her ribcage, struggled to breathe as the atmosphere thickened with oppressive energies. The suffocating darkness seemed to vibrate with the echo of long-lost cries and whispers of agony, blurring the line between the past and the present. The floor beneath her feet began to tremble subtly at first, then more insistently, as if the house itself was awakening from a long slumber. The air grew colder, and the faint, ghostly light began to emanate from no discernible source, casting grotesque shadows against the walls. The shadows twisted and writhed as if they were alive, and for a moment, Ellie thought she saw the figures of people trapped within them, their faces contorted in eternal screams. Ellie, overwhelmed by fear, dropped the diary. It hit the ground with a thud that seemed unnaturally loud in the silence that followed. She tried to step back, but her feet were rooted to the spot, as if the house itself had decided her fate was to remain there, with it, forever. Her mind raced for a solution, a way out of this nightmare, but panic clouded her thoughts. The whispering grew louder, now a deafening roar in her ears. "Stay with us," the voices pleaded, their tones desperate and menacing at once. "Do not leave us alone in the dark." She felt something brush against her arm, soft and insubstantial, like cobwebs, yet it sent a jolt of terror through her. The air around her pulsed with the energy of the spirits, their presence overwhelming. Ellie's flashlight flickered back to life, casting a shaky light that barely pierced the darkness enveloping her. In its beam, she saw the mirror again. It no longer reflected the basement, but showed a different scene entirely, a vision of the house as it had been a century ago, vibrant and alive, yet overshadowed by an aura of impending doom. Transfixed by the image, Ellie watched as figures passed in front of the mirror within that other time. She saw a man, his features eerily similar to the shadowy figure she had encountered, his expression tortured as he performed what looked like a ritual. Beside him, a woman, Abigail, perhaps, her face etched with fear and sorrow. Suddenly, the scene shifted, and the mirror showed Ellie her own reflection again, but she was not alone. Behind her stood the shadowy figure, its presence more formidable than before, its eyes glowing faintly red in the dim light. Ellie, too terrified to move, felt its cold breath on her neck as it leaned closer. "You freed me," it whispered, its voice a chilling caress that made her skin crawl. "Now, you must take my place." Ellie's mind reeled in horror. The realization of what the ritual entailed, a trade of places, a new soul to bind to the house, struck her with the force of a physical blow. She understood now that the house, and the dark forces it harbored, required a keeper, a guardian of its secrets and its curse. Desperate, Ellie turned around to confront the figure, her flashlight beam settling on its vague form. "I will not be trapped here," she declared, her voice trembling but resolute. The figure seemed to pause, considering her words, its form wavering in the unsteady light. "You have no choice," it replied, the menace in its tone unmistakable. "Their house needs a soul to quiet its spirits. It always has." Ellie felt the cold grip of fate tightening around her, but a spark of defiance ignited within her. "There must be another way," she insisted, her mind racing as she scanned the room for anything that might aid her. As the figure advanced, Ellie backed away, her hand brushing against the cold surface of the mirror. A sudden inspiration struck her, a gamble, but her only chance. She remembered the diary, the warnings about the rituals and their power. With a quick, decisive movement, Ellie seized the mirror and hurled it to the ground. The crash echoed through the house like a thunderclap, the mirror shattering into 1,000 pieces, its shards glittering menacingly in the flickering light. The figure let out a roar of rage and pain as the destruction of the mirror seemed to weaken it, its form becoming less defined, more shadow than substance. Ellie didn't wait to see if it would recover. She turned and ran, her only thought to escape the basement and the house before the broken ritual could reclaim her. Up the stairs, through the hallways, she raced, the house groaning and shaking around her as if in protest. She reached the front door, threw it open, and burst into the cool, early morning air, the dawn light washing over her like a cleansing rain. Panting, heart-pounding, Ellie looked back at the house. It stood silent and ominous as the morning sun began to rise, casting long shadows that seemed to claw at the fading darkness. Despite her escape, the house's ominous presence loomed large, its windows like dark, watchful eyes. Ellie knew in her heart that the respite might be temporary. The spirits, though momentarily disrupted, might not remain quiet for long. Gasping for breath, Ellie's mind raced as she contemplated her next steps. She knew she couldn't just leave, the house and its spirits were too entangled with her now, and she feared what might happen if she tried to simply walk away. Her family was due to return soon, and the thought of them walking into this malevolent trap tightened the icy grip of fear around her heart. Determined to protect her loved ones and end this nightmare, Ellie knew she had to find a permanent solution. The shattered mirror, the diary, and the house's tumultuous history pointed towards a dark and complex weave of magic and sacrifice. She needed to understand the full extent of the rituals and perhaps reverse or complete them to free herself and her family from the house's dark influence. With resolve steeling her nerves, Ellie re-entered the house. The air inside was still thick with the remnants of the night's terror, but the morning light streaming through the windows fought back against the shadows, giving her a sliver of courage. She made her way back to the basement, stepping cautiously over the broken shards of the mirror. Amid the debris, Ellie found the diary that had fallen from her hands during her frantic escape. She picked it up, her fingers tracing the aged leather cover. Flipping through the pages, she found more details about the rituals and the specific conditions they required. It spoke of a celestial alignment and a pure-hearted sacrifice, hints that today could be pivotal in breaking the cycle. The house seemed to watch her, an ominous observer, as she read. Ellie could feel the weight of unseen eyes upon her, pressing close with palpable malevolence. She needed something from the house itself to complete the ritual correctly, something that had been part of its original construction, imbued with its essence. Recalling the symbols carved into the old chest in the basement, Ellie retrieved a small piece of the wood chipped from its corner. According to the diary, these symbols represented the house's heart, its core, where all energies converged. With this piece, she could potentially redirect the ritual to cleanse the house rather than bind another soul to it. Outside, in the light of the new dawn, Ellie prepared her own ritual. She drew symbols from the diary in a circle around her, placing the wooden piece at the center. As the sun rose higher, its rays aligning with her makeshift altar, Ellie began to recite the words written in the diary, her voice steady but filled with emotion. The air around her grew charged, the morning breeze swirling into a vortex that centered on the wooden shard. The house groaned, a sound of protest or pain, as the ritual pulled at its foundations. Shadows darted at the edge of Ellie's vision, the spirits of the house stirred into frenzy by her actions. With each word she spoke, the light around her brightened, the shadows dissolving as the ritual's power intensified. The wooden piece began to glow, a deep, pulsing heart of light beating in rhythm with her chant. As Ellie spoke the final word, a shockwave of energy burst forth. The house shook violently, a scream tearing from its very structure, a sound both triumphant and anguished. Then, suddenly, silence fell. Ellie, exhausted, watched as the house before her seemed to settle, its oppressive aura lifting. The sun shone brightly, its light pure and cleansing. She felt a profound peace settle around her, the air now fresh and clear. She had done it. The ritual was complete, the spirits freed, the curse broken. Their house stood quiet, its dark history finally put to rest. Ellie knew that her life would never be the same, but as she walked away from the house, the sun warming her back, she felt a weight lift from her soul. She had faced unimaginable horrors and survived, her strength proven in the light of day. Whatever lay ahead, she was ready to face it, free from the shadows of the past. As Ellie stepped away from the house, her heart still thumping in her chest, she turned back for one last look. The morning sun illuminated the old mansion, casting it in a less sinister light than the one she had come to know. The ominous presence that had pervaded its walls seemed to have dissipated, leaving behind just an old house with creaky boards and a long history. Feeling the last of the tension ebb away, Ellie walked down the pathway leading to the main road, each step lighter than the last. The air was fresh, filled with the scent of the morning dew on the grass, and for the first time in hours, she took a deep, untroubled breath. She was free, truly free, not just from the spirits that had haunted the house, but also from the fear that had gripped her heart. However, as she reached the edge of the property, a sudden chill brushed past her, like the touch of an unseen hand. She paused, a flicker of doubt shadowing her relief. Turning around, she stared at the house standing quietly in the morning light. The windows, once dark and foreboding, now just reflected the blue sky and the trees swaying gently in the breeze. But then, she noticed something peculiar. One of the upstairs curtains fluttered slightly, as though disturbed by an indoor breeze. Ellie frowned, her eyes narrowing. There was no one else scheduled to be at the house yet, and she had made sure all the windows were securely closed after the night's ordeal. A cold sliver of unease wormed its way into her heart. Had she truly freed all the spirits, or had something lingered behind, perhaps too deep and too dark to be cleansed by her ritual? Shaking her head, Ellie forced herself to turn away. Whatever mysteries the house still held, they were no longer hers to solve. She had done what she came to do, broken the chains that had bound the spirits to the house, and perhaps some secrets were meant to remain hidden, tucked away in the shadows of old halls and behind the glass of dusty mirrors. As she walked away, the sun climbed higher, its light washing over the world, chasing away the last remnants of darkness. Ellie didn't look back again. Instead, she focused on the road ahead, on her future, bright and unburdened. Yet, as she disappeared down the road, the house stood silent, watching. The fluttering curtain stilled, as if at a command. Inside, the shadows gathered once more, pooling in the corners and under the old furniture. Their house breathed, a slow, ponderous inhalation, as if preparing for the next chapter of its long, mysterious life. In the stillness, a whisper echoed through the empty halls, a soft, almost imperceptible sigh. Till next time, it murmured, a promise or a threat, lingering in the air like the faintest trace of smoke. And the house waited, as it always had, for new secrets to fill its rooms, for new spirits to walk its floors. It waited with the patience of stone and time, under the watchful eyes of the sun and the stars, holding its breath for the next unwitting visitor to cross its threshold and awaken the stories embedded in its walls. The end was just another beginning.